Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, and let the story drift off to sleep in peace. First, please subscribe and leave a comment no matter where you're watching from. Imagine a world where a woman's worth was measured not by what she said, but by how gracefully she stayed silent. The 1920s. An era of jazz, of flickering silent films, of the first trembling steps toward women's suffrage, carried within it a secret architecture of expectation. Beneath the beaded dresses and the bobbed hair, beneath the scandal of the Charleston and the defiance of the speakeasy, there exists a rigid, invisible framework. Unwritten, unspoken, and yet understood by every woman who lived within it. She did not need to be told. She simply knew. Part 2: The Etiquette of Silence in the Drawing Rooms of 1920s America and Britain. A well-bred woman was expected to speak only when spoken to in the company men she did not know well. This was not considered cruelty. It was called refinement. A woman who volunteered her opinion too readily, who interrupted, who raised her voice above a certain register, was considered common. Coarse. The word itself, unladylike, functioned as a kind of social verdict, swift and damning. She was permitted to laugh, but not too loudly. She was permitted to disagree, but only with a smile. She could express displeasure only indirectly, through a careful pause, a tilted glance, a gentle redirection of conversation. To speak plainly, to say what she meant without the softening cushion of performance, was to risk everything: social standing, marriage prospects, the protection of her reputation. And reputation in 1920 was still currency. Part 3: The body as a public document. Her body was not entirely her own. This was not merely a matter of law, though laws reflected it, but of atmosphere, of expectations so deeply embedded it felt like nature. A woman in the 1920s navigated an elaborate grammar of the physical. The length of her hem, the collar, the degree to which her ankles were visible as she stepped from a motor car, the flapper, that symbol of rebellion we so readily romanticize, was herself subject to a revised, but no less demanding set of rules. She could bare her arms, yes. She could shorten her skirt to the knee. She was still expected to be pleasing, still expected to maintain a certain lightness, a certain availability to the gaze. The revolution in fashion was real, but it did not release women from the obligation of performing femininity. It simply renegotiated the terms. Posture was character. Slouching was moral failure. A woman who carried herself with anything less than upright grace was judged to be careless with herself, and therefore careless in other ways. Part 4: The table as theater meals were not simply meals. They were examinations. A woman hosting a dinner in the 1920s was responsible for the precise placement of 7 pieces of silverware, the temperature of the soup, the seamlessness of the conversation, and the comfort of every guest, all while remaining herself invisible in her effort. The labor had to disappear. If the evening felt effortless, she had succeeded. If anything went wrong, a delay from the kitchen, an awkward silence, a guest who drank too much, it reflected upon her. At the table, a lady was not to speak of money, of illness, or of politics with any real conviction. She could allude to these things. She could murmur politely at the edges of a subject. But to stake out a position, to argue, to bring the discomfort of genuine opinion into the candlelit room, that was considered a disruption. And a woman who disrupted dinner was a woman who made herself memorable in all the wrong ways. She ate modestly. She drank modestly. She was modest in her appetite for everything, because appetite itself, the visible wanting of things, was considered unfeminine. Part 5. The rules of the street outside the home. The rules multiplied. A respectable woman in the early 1920s did knock alone after dark in most cities without risking her reputation. She did not enter certain establishments unaccompanied. She did not make eye contact with strangers in a way that could be misread as invitation. She was responsible, always, for the interpretations others placed upon her presence. The arrival of the automobile complicated everything and simplified nothing. A woman seen in a motor car with a man who was not her husband or a close family member was subject to whisper. The car, that symbol of freedom and modernity, became simply another space in which she had to manage appearances. Freedom of movement had arrived, but arrived wearing conditions. In department stores, those new cathedrals of feminine consumer life, a woman was expected to be polite to salespeople, but not familiar, decisive, but not demanding, interested instead, but not excessive in her spending. The ideal woman shopper was contained even in her pleasures. Part 6. Marriage, work, and the performance of contentment. By 1920, more women were entering the workforce than any prior point in American history. Yet even in the office, she operated within a separate set of expectations. A working woman was to be competent, but not ambitious in a way that made uncomfortable. She was to dress professionally, but not expensively. Too fine a wardrobe suggested she was spending money inappropriately, or worse, that she thought herself above her station. If she was married and working, she was expected to demonstrate that her work did not diminish her domestic commitments. To maintain the home as evidence that the marriage was undisturbed by her independence. She could not be seen to want more than she had. Discontent in a wife was a social embarrassment. And this is the extraordinary thing. Women of the 1920s found ways to want things. They organized. They voted for the first time in 920 in the United States. They wrote, they painted, they danced until their feet ached, and then danced more. They moved within the cage of expectation and found, in the moving, something that looked very much like freedom. Part 7. What was never said aloud. The most powerful rule of 1920s etiquette for women was the one that governed all the others. She was not to reveal that she knew the rules existed. To acknowledge the performance was to break it. A truly refined woman internalized so completely that appeared simply to be herself. Naturally gracious, naturally accommodating. The labor of it was to be erased. This is why the unspoken rules were so effective. They could not be challenged because they could not be named. A woman who objected to them, she was being dramatic, oversensitive, unpleasant. The rules were invisible, and therefore everywhere. They were the air she breathed and the water she moved through. And the world called this air normal, and called this water simply life. But some women saw through it. Some women wrote about it in private diaries, were not I must confess to you something I cannot say elsewhere. Part I, the woman who remains. We do not always know their names. History has a habit of recording the remarkable exception and erasing the eloquent ordinary. But the women who navigated the unspoken rules of the 1920s, who held their posture and modulated their voices, and managed their appearances across every room they entered, were not simply compliant. They were, many of them, extraordinary practitioners of the survival art. They understood that the rules were not nature. They understood, even without the language we now have for it, that what's called feminine grace was in fact feminine labor. And in the space between what was expected and what was felt, between the public performance and the private self, they built inner lives of great complexity and great deed. The unspoken rules of the 1920s did not defeat these women. They shaped them, constrained them, exhausted them, and in some essential way, they did not define them. Because beneath every remeasured smile and every careful silence, there was a woman who exactly she was doing. And why? And why's cost? That woman is still here, in the record. If you know how to listen for her. End of narration script. Hiskly sourced. Cinematically rendered.